imagining, planning and building projects that will set the character for generations to come. Today, we want to challenge you to reimagine the future, to try on other realities, predict different possible outcomes, and to experience other viewpoints. Because the growth of Parramatta is inevitable, and in fact desirable, but the destruction of its character and the loss of public places is not acceptable. The question is not whether Parramatta is going to change, the question is how. In the end, Parramatta will not simply be defined by what we create, but it will be defined by what we refuse to destroy.
Parramatta is very clearly a place that people care about, and we really want to ensure that there can be some clear outcomes from today that can help identify not only the threats, but also the opportunities that exist in Parramatta. This is not an anti-development forum. I'd like to describe it as a right kind of development forum. And we're trying to really ensure that there is the right kind of development in Parramatta. I think we need to stop considering Parramatta as a blank canvas. I think if it was a real estate brochure, it's almost as though Parramatta was being advertised as a knockdown and rebuild special, subject to council approval, of course. But as the Willow Grove saga has shown us, there's an increasing tendency perhaps to move away from the renovate and more to the detonate, to keep with the real estate lingo. There's a very rich series of layers here in Parramatta, and I wanted to repeat Neil's words of Jane Jacobs when she said that designing a dream city is easy, but rebuilding a living one takes imagination.
Heritage often sits silently at the margins of urbanism and planning, particularly where market forces and competition have eroded humanistic values and public spiritedness. For many, the economics or values of heritage just don't stack up. So, where we really are deeply desirous of culture, of inclusion, of connectedness, combined with that intricate diversity of relationships and processes in these human-centred places, what makes cities memorable and engaging? And I too, like David, would like to reference Jane Jacobs when she says cities need history. They need old buildings so badly it's impossible to imagine places flourishing without them. Can you please give us a picture of what the local community thinks and feels about the treatment of history and heritage in Parramatta?
Well, we've certainly not been quiet about what we think is happening in Parramatta, and it's almost become a full-time job for us to advocate to try and retain our heritage and our character. And I think what the community is starting to feel is that we're having an identity crisis. We're losing our identity, and we're fast becoming a Chatswood Mark II.
I think there's a lot of misconception around what a diverse community wants and expects from their city. There's a belief that a diverse community is wanting, as Suzette referenced, a shiny new city without that grittiness. But regardless of your age, where you've come from, what experiences you're seeking, you want a place that does have a sense of place, that actually understands itself and understands where it wants to be. And Parramatta, as David so eloquently expressed, has got such an important place that it has come from, and it's important that we actually showcase that. The more we talk about that, and the more we actually identify that it's not just also about individual little buildings, it's about streetscapes and landscapes, then we can start to have a much broader offering for the whole community.
We have this huge culture of disposable architecture, of single-use architecture. I'm not talking about plastic here, I'm talking about buildings. Buildings that are meant to last over 100 years. As an architect, that's what we strive for. And at the same time, we have this need for something new, something that's flashy, something that's very clinical in our city, that deprives us of community. It becomes soulless. How can we shift this culture that is very apparent in Australia, where decision makers and policy makers are so happy to demolish and start new again when we already have so much to offer, when we have so much stories to tell?
One of the most frustrating things community is coming up against is state significant developments where effectively the Heritage Act is turned off and doesn't apply to state heritage places, or for that matter Indigenous places, under the National Parks Act. And the community groups are just, astounded when they find this out, that this Heritage Act that is supposed to protect these places can literally get switched on and off at whim, and it's a huge concern that we've seen for people out there.
Interesting. So that the protection that perhaps many communities fought for in the late 60s, early 70s, and new generations are connecting with today aren't necessarily having the effect in terms of protection that we once might have hoped.
I think if a city doesn't respect its own past, how can new migrants coming in think that we're going to respect their story if we don't respect our own? Where does that respect go if we're rubbishing our own stories? How are any new people coming into town going to think that we're going to respect their stories?
Yeah, and the past stories are the migrant stories. Yeah. It's just a different wave of migration. Yeah. So for us to think for 1 minute that that story from 220 years ago doesn't resonate with somebody that moves to Australia in the 1990s is ridiculous, because it does, because they've chosen to live or to work in Parramatta, and they have been attracted to this place because of its sense of place and what it has to offer. And that's why we need to actually recognise that Parramatta is unique.
I have to say, I love the National Trust saying this is a blueprint for truly lovable cities. Because if a place is lovable, it's livable. It's good in every way. It's sustainable.
This is such a big story that connects all the way down to Old Government House, of this beautiful architectural and environmental and landscape stories that can be this huge untapped resource for Parramatta for tourism, which we seem to be worried about placemaking. What about placekeeping?
The identity that's being built on these kind of neighbourhood isn't one that's about placemaking, because a lot of developers now think that they can tack on identity being just branding. Yeah. We can brand a place and then that's what's going to attract people there. That's just marketing. Yeah. That's advertising. That's developers trying to, look at how they can attract people, but without actually investing to what's already there and really accentuating the sense of place.
And it's actually the places between the buildings. That's where we walk around. That's where we live. And it's those places that do enable people to have accidental connectedness. People, Bill Bowen, nobody had heard of until a building was put there. But the female factory could actually be an international destination telling a feminist story, and it should be.
I think it would be really remiss of us here today to not acknowledge that Parramatta is at a critical point in its development and in its World Heritage status. We all looked on in horror last year when UNESCO, for only the third time, delisted a World Heritage city, which was Liverpool in the UK. And the reason they delisted it was because of unsympathetic developments happening on its periphery and ruining its setting and view lines in and out. And when Old Government House and Parramatta Park went onto the World Heritage List, you know, the nomination dossier noted even then that the setting was being compromised and that it was high risk and that controls needed to be put in place.
And that is the real challenge, is that they're not brought along as part of the challenge, as part of that conversation until it's too late. And then by that stage, it's a heritage interpretation on the wall somewhere. And I think that's the really frustrating part. We need to make it easier for everyone in the community to be able to have a part of that process, be part of that process.
As we start moving into the election campaigning, because of course we have a state election next year, that's something that the National Trust is really trying to think about is what are the key causes that we're seeing that are resulted in all these, you know, spot fires at individual site levels. So how do we look at those big picture causes? And one of them, of course, is how do we get heritage considered at that land use planning stage rather than at the development application stage?
I think we're talking around the issue that the state has, in a very focused and sophisticated way, removed planning from the community, from the citizen. I like the idea of citizen architect, but it's not an accident. It's being designed in that way. And the City of Sydney is powerful enough to be able to push back to an extent, but in the end the community has the power. We've seen the Teal women all being elected because of that. So you can't give up. You have to begin as a new era, really.
How do we create a love story to Parramatta, and what story should Parramatta be telling?
Well, I think we already have started the love story. I mean, the fact that there's so many people here today in Parramatta and that Parramatta's been chosen as the site for this particular event just goes to show how much respect there is for how important Parramatta is, not just to the Sydney story, but the state and the whole of the nation.
This is actually one of the hearts of probably 600 that we painted for the Valentine's Day campaign we ran for Willow Grove. And we had people turn up and write their love notes on these timber hearts, which the government ripped down. But it was very hard for the government to respond to that campaign out of the 2 years of different campaigns we had to try and do during COVID, which had to be very artistic. But it was the love campaign. And I know this from talking to the consultant from Oricon after the battle, and she said that was the one that the government stopped and went, ooh, because they could not, I guess, fight the love story.
And to borrow from the Women's Committee of the National Trust, there's no time to spare. Thank you. Which you can see.
Parramatta's at a kind of crisis point with its heritage and the whole rezoning thing, which I think stands to be catastrophic. But I think the kind of sense of crisis is much bigger than that and involves, you know, everything, every place that we live in, from our small homes to our cities to our planet, and it's all the same issue. It's about respecting what we've got and understanding that what we need to do is a collaboration and not an exploitation. So I think we need to rethink the future in a much more, this has been touched on, much more localised, pedestrian, this is a place we live, these are lives that we enjoy kind of way, and I think it can be done.
Heritage is just, it's a concept that has been kind of dreamed up in academia. It's a layer that we're told we have to look after, but it's part of our entire urban experience from dawn till dark. And
even just walking here from the railway station, I couldn't see any of the landmarks I knew. I came out in a place that I didn't actually know where I was. It kind of really struck me that those sorts of things, those icons, places that we know, are suddenly disappearing.
I was just talking to someone in the break there, and they were talking, just saying Parramatta needs a heritage plan, and by that they don't mean another planning layer and all that stuff. It's kind of, we've written a 1,000-page report on this building and a 1,000-page report on that building and a 10,000-page report on Willow Grove. All of these things, but actually if we just sat down for a second and went, actually, between Old Government House and River, that's a bit important. And between here and there, that's a bit important. And between there and there, that's a bit important. And those 3 houses over there that I mentioned, they're really important. So, and it wouldn't take too long to actually come up with those important bits, and then the freckles can come elsewhere. But it's that kind of, otherwise you do run the risk, I think, of putting those mistakes in the wrong spots.
And of course in other cities, and including Sydney, we've done some miraculous rescue work on small little bits of leftover space. But north of the river, there's this fantastic opportunity. And we must grab that. Very few people in Sydney have ever been to North Parramatta. People know the back streets of Paris, but they don't know the back streets of Parramatta. So we've got to invigorate the community and the powers that be, that here is a once in a generational opportunity to do something really, really great and inspirational.
The pressures that are on North Parramatta right now to protect these places, what can we do to reassess? What can we do to capture these opportunities that you're talking about?
I don't think it's a matter of protection so much as careful management, sensitive management.
But somebody has posted a question that I think kind of touches on this, and I don't know who it is, but they said I offered my artistic son cheap rental for our nice flat in Parramatta CBD. He turned it down because Parramatta looked like a cultural desert to him. So what can be done to enliven this place culturally?
Look, I think we can stop fixing it. Stop trying to fix it. I think there's a limit to what we can achieve through the logical design of space, and there's a limit to what we can achieve by over-curating space. And Parramatta passed that limit about, a couple of $1 billion worth of development ago. So I think that's where you've got to draw the line.
You're not getting those sort of, those bits of graffiti, those narrow lanes anymore. And so it is partly the planning controls that have, whether it's, I'm not saying that it isn't about fixing, but it's allowing some of those things to happen.
Harris Park's hanging in there. I think that's a good example. And I think when we think of Parramatta, think of Granville, think of Auburn, think of those places in its orbit, those boroughs of Parramatta. And it's a borough structure really that I think we probably need to promote. And they're hidden. The best parts of Parramatta, it's got an underground textile industry, right, where people are working away, designing. It's got, all of those things happening right under our noses.
So it's about celebrating what we have.
And letting some of it be.
Yeah.
The future of Parramatta and the future of other cities. And I suppose, I think about what I value in other places and how those elements could translate into planning controls. And they're things like fine grain, relationship to the street, a certain degree of density. It could be fairly high density. Things like protecting views to places as being sort of important markers of a city. Not having to walk too far before you can cross through a block, and how those things can be written into planning controls to make any place a great city.
For example, there was a convict drain, and all the archaeologists in the room will go, oh yeah. But it goes from here, it goes to there. But at some point along it, someone said, oh, but we can remove this little bit because we're going to develop that bit. And then someone else here said, oh, we can remove this little bit and we can do that. And then all we end up with is like all these towers with little bits of when we actually had the whole drain there, and it's about linking these things together. And I think when we talk about isolated examples, it's good and well because we might have done something okay there, but it's actually, in its own way, it contributes to these little gradual bits of erosion. And I think that there's, there are some really great things, like the Western Sydney University occupies some very old historic buildings, and that's a fantastic thing in Parramatta. And that could, of course, happen in some of the other buildings at the female factory.
Well, the Rocks was saved, as you know, by community action and the professions getting behind the community and so on. And so opportunities for massive commercial investment were tossed out, much to the distress of the development industry. But now we've got this wonderful precinct. North Parramatta has a precinctual quality about it. And it could be saved as a precinct, not as a series of detached heritage sites, but as a total environment that has opportunities for new buildings, for old buildings, for public spaces, for community activities, outdoor, indoor, the lot. And it's got the river, and it's got Phil's Governor's Walk. What more could you want?
I think just to take that point though, I think one of the reasons, maybe, I wasn't there, that the rocks was protected was because people knew about the rocks. And as Sharon pointed out in the previous panel, the Female Factory has been an institution. People haven't been in there and seen it and understand it and know it exists and that it's worth protecting. So I think the more that we can get people to know it, to experience it, then people will protect, people will identify it as a place worth it. Does that tower need to be right next to the 23-metre wide Parramatta River? Because you'll still get a good view if it was just a little bit further back. And it would mean that when you exit your tower and walk along the river like you do in Adelaide, it's not a raging torrent or anything there either, is it? But it's surrounded by some parklands and it has a feel to it. So I think people can have these towers and they can, that can happen, and that's why we're saying it's not anti-development, it's a right development.
Parramatta in the Indigenous context over millennia was a great place of exchange, simply because it's a space on a river. But I think we shouldn't feel as though that heritage has been eradicated, it's been built over. And I think one of the ways that we can address that is promoting Indigenous stories, of course, giving them the preeminence that they deserve, but actually letting them guide some of the planning exercises. Parramatta has always been that place of intersection, politically, historically, and in storytelling.
And there'll be probably a statement from the Premier saying how important it is to engage with our First Nations people. But it hasn't happened.
One of the things that we could do for Parramatta, and we'd be very, very strongly pushing for, is if we have a federal push to take up the statement from the heart, let Parramatta be the site where we sign the treaty.
Yeah. Good. Here.
My magic wand is thinking about the people, planning for the people, and at ground level. I think that is kind of, if we think about that first, then we're going to have a better city.
I think if I did have that magic wand, it would be just to it's not about the place, it's people, and having the ability for people to see what there is here. Like, I think, and to see the opportunities. I think if you could make the politicians, the planners, the this, the that, because let's be honest, some politicians see things and others don't, and some planners see things, some don't. But if everyone could actually just see the potential that there was in a place, it doesn't matter whether it's Parramatta or Liverpool or Campbelltown, all these places are coming under threat. If people could see what was there, then they might stop and think just a little bit and say, actually, that's a bit important. We should consider that a little bit more before we proceed.
It's not a separate thing. It's part of our everyday life and everything that we do. It's how we live, it's how we evolve. For all of our panellists, thank you so much for your contributions. For Sharon Veal, our moderator from our first session, and our own Vanilla, who's done a wonderful job as moderator and MC for the day. Thank you all for being here today and being part of this important and challenging conversation.